admit to the British people that this deal takes this country back under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which is now able once again to overrule our courts, surrendering our judicial sovereignty?
Through the House on that basis.
Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just point out to the Prime Minister that nothing can undo the fact that 17.5 million people voted leave, and they voted to take back control of our laws and to stop paying money to the EU. And that was a considerably larger vote than the 9.7 million who voted Labour at the last election. And now he is submitting to EU regulations without any control, and he is giving money, starting to pay money back to the European Union. He's giving up control over our laws and restoring payments to the European Union. He will pay a bitter political price for this betrayal.
My fishermen are furious that the Prime Minister has surrendered the fishing industry, and my constituents are furious that you've surrendered on freedom of movement and on rule-taking under the ECJ. But there is good news, Mr. Prime Minister. Do you accept that you've also surrendered the jobs of many of your backbench MPs in the next general election to reform?
Tensions exploded in the House of Commons as members of Parliament launched a relentless wave of criticism at Prime Minister Keir Starmer, accusing him of engineering a quiet but far-reaching reversal of Brexit promises. The accusations were clear. Britain, after finally unshackling itself from the European Union, was now drifting back toward regulatory alignment, budgetary contributions and judicial entanglements under Starmer's leadership.
He knows full well that we had a red line about not rejoining the EU, no single market, no customs union, no freedom of movement. We were told it was impossible to negotiate a better deal with the EU with those red lines. We've just done it. We've also showed that we are outside the EU because he will appreciate that having a deal with India and the US is inconsistent with membership of the EU. Could be no better evidence that we're not going back into the EU, nor are these negotiations on that basis. I know he understands that very, very well. I'm surprised at the way he puts his question. As for control of the borders, honestly, it went from quadrupling net migration after Brexit to nearly 1 million. That wasn't controlling our borders. It was a complete lack of control on the other side. Mr. Speaker, on the question of payments, I do think it's important to appreciate that we've achieved unprecedented access to EU markets without the budgetary payments of member states. That is an incredible achievement. The only payment of the SPS agreement are administrative costs to support the relevant costs of implementing and administering the scheme. For schemes and payments where it's in our national interest, we will negotiate proportionate contributions, as already happens under the deal negotiated by them, for example, in relation to R&D and into Horizon.
The initial salvo came with a stark reminder: 17.4 million people had voted to leave the EU. That decision, many MPs insisted, wasn't just a referendum on trade, it was a cry for sovereignty. Sovereignty over borders, sovereignty over money, and above all, sovereignty over British laws. Yet, critics argue, the current direction under Starmer appears to erase those red lines. EU regulations are creeping back in, financial contributions to European frameworks are returning, and the one thing Leave voters wanted most, control, feels increasingly out of reach. What stings even more for some MPs is the framing of this U-turn as a diplomatic win. Starmer's administration has touted renewed access to EU markets as a breakthrough, but according to his opponents, that access comes at a steep price, a surrender of control disguised as cooperation.
For a youth mobility scheme to help get their youth unemployment figures down. So can the Prime Minister tell the House what impact assessment he has done on his youth scheme for youth unemployment for young Brits, particularly white working class boys who suffer the most? And can he tell the House today the cap he has put on numbers for people coming into the UK? If he can't, this is a bitter betrayal of British youth.
The issue of immigration reignited deep frustrations across the Commons. MPs pointed to post-Brexit migration figures that defied expectations. Net migration had not only failed to fall, but had soared to nearly 1 million in recent years. For those who champion Brexit on the promise of tighter border control, this was nothing short of betrayal. But it wasn't just about the numbers. The Prime Minister's recent push for a youth mobility scheme with the European Union raised eyebrows across party lines. Critics saw it as an economic patch for Europe's struggling youth, rather than a benefit tailored to Britain's working class. Countries like France and Spain, where youth unemployment has been persistently high, stood to gain the most. The elephant in the room was the impact on British youths, especially white working class boys, a group consistently underrepresented in higher education and skilled employment. MPs demanded clarity. Where was the impact assessment? Where was the cap on incoming migrants? Where were the guarantees that this wouldn't spiral into a backdoor revival of free movement?
Young people in the United Kingdom the opportunity to work, to study and to travel in Europe. It is going to be a capped scheme of limited duration and with visas, something again everybody said we couldn't negotiate. We have negotiated. And in relation to our question about what we're doing for young people in this country, she should look to the trailblazer schemes that we set up that are helping young people back into work.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The most pernicious part of this deal is dynamic alignment, by which we become an automatic rule taker from the European Union. Labour have been briefing journalists. We have an opt-out from that. I've read the document in detail. We don't. And besides, the ECJ is the ultimate arbiter in a dispute. It is, so the EU will always win. Why, Prime Minister, when the British people voted peacefully and democratically to leave the European Union, have you surrendered that right and made us a rule taker to the EU once again?
Starmer's government insists the scheme is capped, temporary and structured around visas, something they claim was previously deemed impossible to negotiate. But opposition MPs weren't convinced. At the heart of the Commons clash was a far more fundamental concern: Britain's legal autonomy. For many MPs, the Brexit mandate wasn't just about trade or migration, it was about ending the European Union's grip on British law. And yet, they argued the latest agreement threatens to reverse that victory. The deal's critics pointed to a clause known as dynamic alignment, a mechanism that requires the UK to stay in lockstep with evolving EU regulations in certain sectors. According to them, this effectively turns Britain into a passive rule taker, forced to obey decisions made in Brussels without any voice at the table.
Just on the question of how the rules are made, they will go through a parliamentary process in this House. In this House. We are already aligned. We are in alignment. We are just not getting the benefit of it. This gives us the benefit which will be counted in the business jobs and bills that we can deal with this. And in relation to an independent arbiter, there's independent arbitration where there's disputes in this agreement. They all know this. Every trade deal has an arbitration clause to deal with the settlement of disputes. All trade deals have that, including all the trade deals that they have negotiated. On the question of the ECJ, if there's an issue of European law that needs to be referred by the independent arbitrators to the court, they then give a ruling on the interpretation. It passes back to the arbitrators to make the final decision. That is how trade deals work. But I do understand their new policy. Their new policy is against any trade deals. That's never been the Conservative Party policy before, but it's good that we've got clarity now.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Boston...
And then came the issue of the European Court of Justice. Though the government insists that arbitration under the New Deal is independent, MPs highlighted the ECJ's continued role in interpreting disputes involving EU law. To them, this means British courts could once again be overruled by a foreign judiciary. The government countered by framing it as standard international practice. Arbitration panels, they said, were part of every major trade deal globally, and in those rare cases where interpretation of EU law is required, the ECJ offers a legal opinion that arbitrators then use to make a final decision. But for those on the backbenches, that explanation fell flat. Among the most impassioned voices in Parliament were those speaking for Britain's coastal constituencies, places that had voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, clinging to the promise of a fishing renaissance. For these communities, the European Union symbolised years of economic decline and foreign control over British waters. Brexit, they believed, would finally reclaim that legacy. But MPs from regions like Boston and Skegness said the reality has been anything but. Local fishermen, once hopeful, now feel discarded. New agreements, they argue, continue to prioritise EU access over UK sovereignty, offering little protection to the livelihoods of those who depended on the sea. For them, it isn't just about quotas, it's about betrayal.
Skegness, my fishermen are furious that the Prime Minister has surrendered the fishing industry, and my constituents are furious that you've surrendered on freedom of movement and on rule-taking under the ECJ. But there is good news, Mr. Prime Minister. Do you accept that you've also surrendered the jobs of many of your backbench MPs at the next general election to reform?
Well, I'll happily explain to his constituents the huge benefits of these deals measured in jobs that will be saved, jobs that can now thrive, bills that will come down. And it is really important for our economy that we have these deals. That is in the interest of his constituents. It's in the interest of the whole country.
Regular point.
Thank you.
Beyond fishing, the broader concern is what these decisions say about the future of British industry and identity. Constituents are watching as freedom of movement returns in new forms, as rule-taking under the ECJ creeps back in, and as their communities are left with more questions than answers. And in a striking political warning, MPs made it clear this perceived betrayal won't just cost jobs in fishing villages, it could cost the Prime Minister his majority. Reform UK, the rising right-wing challenger, is gaining ground. And if nothing changes, Starmer's backbenchers may soon find themselves out of office. The closing salvos in the Commons weren't just about ideology, they were about economics. Even MPs who supported certain aspects of EU cooperation demanded to know. If the UK was already aligned with European food and safety standards, why accept a deal that gives the EU the power to dictate future changes? This, they argued, was the moment Britain should have pushed for mutual recognition, an arrangement where two trading partners acknowledge each other's standards without requiring constant alignment. Other countries had done it, why couldn't Britain? The concern wasn't abstract. If the EU tightens its standards tomorrow, UK businesses would have little choice but to comply or risk being shut out of the European market. And because of dynamic alignment, that compliance might come without any meaningful say in the rules themselves.
British people that this deal takes this country back under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which is now able once again to overrule our courts, surrendering our judicial sovereignty.
No, I mean, that's just wrong under the agreement. There's an independent arbitration. It's the same. It's the same as the Windsor framework, which you negotiated. It is an important point. It's an independent arbitration process. There's the same process for pretty well every trade deal that's struck, not just by us and other countries, but most other countries. In this particular case, if the independent arbitration needs reference on a point of law, it's referred to the ECJ, which then refers it back to the independent arbitrator to make a decision. So that's how it operates.
Josh Dean. Speaker. Can I thank... If the Prime Minister is right that our food standards are already in a...
Critics argued this wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a sign that Britain had returned to the negotiating table with its hands half-tied and leverage squandered. In response, the Prime Minister's allies pointed to the broader benefits: market access, lower bills, more stable business conditions. But to those on the opposition benches, that sounded far too familiar. For them, the whole arrangement resembled a quiet return to EU membership in everything but name. And for many who backed Brexit, this wasn't cooperation, it was capitulation. The debate over Brexit isn't over. For many MPs and voters, the latest deals look less like progress and more like a quiet return to the EU's influence. From migration to legal rulings to trade rules, the promises made in 2016 now feel uncertain. As political pressure builds and Reform UK gains ground, the question is clear. Has Britain truly taken back control or given it away again? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more updates like this, hit like and subscribe.